The first chapter of this manga is insane. It starts with a kid getting his arm cut off, which regrows before he takes that cut arm, feeds it to some old people, his sister asks him this, then everyone in his village, including his sister, gets burnt to a crisp right in front of him by an evil fascist who sets him on fire forever. That's the start of Fire Punch, written by Tatsuki Fujimoto, the same guy who would go on to write the similarly insane manga Chainsaw Man 3 years later. While it lays a lot of groundwork for that future series, Fujimoto was able to tell a really unique and engaging story in Fire Punch's 80 chapters. However, I will warn you that the first chapter is just the start to the sensitive topics it covers, so if any of the things scrolling on screen right now are something you're not okay reading, this manga is not for you. Despite all of those horrible things, I haven't been able to get Fire Punch out of my head since I first read it over 2 months ago. Literally, thoughts of this manga have followed me everywhere I go, from school, to hanging out with friends, to even when I'm taking a shit. And the more I think about it, the more I think it's actually a masterpiece. Everything from the character writing, to the stellar art, to even the surprising representation, shaped this manga into a one-of-a-kind story that I think I love.
And if you give it a chance, you might too.
To better understand why I feel this way, let's start by taking a bit of a deeper look at Chapter 1. It starts by introducing us to the setting of the story, a world covered by snow by a mysterious person called the Ice Witch. This is a really cool and promising setting that Fujimoto delivers on quite well. He created this expansive cold world from his cramped $200 apartment with no AC, it serving as a twisted inversion of his current life. These types of reflections and inversions become a running theme throughout the story, taking a lot of inspiration from his own life as well as the world around him. This helped inspire parts of the story, like the main character Agni. While his name comes from the Sanskrit word for fire, reflecting his current situation, the cannibalism of him is also a morbid twist on Onpan Man, a Japanese children's superhero who helps people by feeding them part of his head that's made up of a Japanese bread sweet called onpan, which he can regenerate, which in a way introduces us to the power system of Fire Punch, blessings. It's essentially a superpowered genetic lottery where if you're lucky enough you can get nearly any power, from regeneration, which is what Agni has, to mind reading, to even fire that can't be put out until it burns to ash. The last one is wielded by the kind of main villain of the story, Doma. Doma is the guy who killed everyone Agni loved and cared about right in front of him, then set him on infinite fire,
all because of a misunderstanding.
He's also a military commander for one of the few remaining cities, Behemdorg, which is a city just brimming with fascist maniacs, kind of like modern-day Florida. Doma's fire traps Agni in agonizing pain for the next third of his life, constantly regenerating. But after 8 long years of constant suffering, he's finally able to withstand the pain and get up, his mind filled with nothing but rage for Doma. All of that comes together to make a really promising start to the story. But by now you're probably realizing I skipped over a pretty major thing I mentioned in the intro. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the incest. Believe it or not, I do not like incest, and I think its inclusion here was wholly unnecessary. It's a major turnoff for the story, leading a lot of people, nearly including myself, to drop it after just 1 chapter. While I understand why it was included, to show the levels of desperateness the cold world has brought people to, I think the story would have been better off without it. Especially because the same thing is repeatedly showcased in the same chapter. At the start, by cannibalism, and at the end, the enslavement of people by the Behemdorgians. With that being said, I think this manga is able to succeed on so many levels despite this pretty major gripe, and that's all because of Fujimoto's one-of-a-kind writing style. During an interview with fellow mangaka Hiroaki Samura, Fujimoto talks about how he wants to write manga like a Korean movie, because while watching a Korean movie, it's hard to tell what the director is thinking, but in the end, it all comes together. And that's exactly what reading his manga feels like. That sense of leaving the reader unable to anticipate what comes next while not feeling lost is something that his work does quite well. During that interview, he specifically mentioned the Korean movie The Chaser, directed by Na Hong-jin. The plot centers around the main character hunting down the villain, but instead of saving their showdown for the climax, the villain is beaten up and caught within the first 30 minutes of the movie, leaving the viewer lost as to what will happen next. Those 30 minutes are actually partially mirrored in the opening chapters of Fire Punch. Just 7 chapters after getting up, Agni makes it to Behemdorg and confronts Doma, a shell of a man he was 8 years ago who cries and begs forgiveness, saying he'll do anything for him but die. In all typical shonen, like in all typical movies, this interaction would have been saved for much later in the story, but here, it's used as a jumping off point for the rest of the story. This unorthodox but engaging writing continues throughout the entirety of Fire Punch, making the story an amazing page-turner, with the style even bleeding into the 3 strange character archetypes we meet throughout it, who greatly help immerse the reader in the story. Religious fanatics, nihilists, and a third type we'll get into later. Religious fanatics is an insanely bizarre choice for an archetype, but it works incredibly well. In a world where the feeling of cold death is tangible everywhere, most people cling on to hope that something divine can save them. This is best embodied by the character's son, a young boy Agni saves on his way to Behemdorg, who believes Agni to be God. No matter how many times Agni tells him he's not, Son won't quit, At one point, Sun's belief even begins spreading, leading to a group of freed slaves from Behemdorg to start a cult around Agni. Agni's followers aren't the only ones like this, though. There are thousands of people in Behemdorg who believe in their own god that controls all, allowing them the moral excuse to have slaves and do all kinds of heinous shit. They even have video proof of their god, which is actually just an ancient shitty B-movie from before the snow. This weird choice of an archetype can be seen as a critique on modern religious fanatics and the over-reliance we see on religion today. Both in Fire Punch and the real world, fanatics use their religion as an excuse to be insanely bigoted and hostile towards others, with the Behemdorgians being the fictional equivalent of religious nationalists, killing and enslaving anyone who doesn't believe in their god. This comparison doesn't just apply to the absolutely deranged people, though. Fujimoto also pokes at those who believe that their god controls their entire life, relying solely on their god to bring them safety instead of being proactive, kinda like Sun did at the start of the manga. The Nihilists are the second most prevalent force in this world, and they just embrace the overwhelming sense of death, knowing that there isn't really a way out of it. This archetype is helmed by Judah, a Behemdorg soldier who just happens to look exactly like Luna, Agni's dead sister, and who's been tasked with killing Agni by the Behemdorg government. Ever since she was a kid, she's known that Behemdorg's god is fake, being told by her father that she has to pretend to hear God's voice to keep humanity united. Living that lie wears down her mental state over her 100-year-long life, only being kept alive due to her regeneration blessing. She's become sick of the world, waiting for it to end so she can end her charade, sinking her into a depressive state in which she eventually tries to kill herself using Agni's flames. We end up meeting a lot of people with her depressed and nihilistic mindset throughout the story, from soldiers in the Behemdorg army to people inside the cult's ranks and even Agni at the start of the manga. Fujimoto portrays this archetype as more grounded, while still using it as commentary on nihilism's prevalence in the modern world, and the negative effects it can have on people's mental well-being, shown through the traits of depression exhibited by nearly all the characters that fit this archetype. Both of these camps are wildly unorthodox, yet nearly encompass everyone we meet. Their strangeness is understandable and almost reasonable in this cruel world covered by ice. But remember how I said there were 3 character archetypes? The last one we meet is an anomaly, consisting of one person unable to fit into either camp, and that's what makes them the best character in the entire story. Introduced with a multi-page monologue about their love for movies that directly interrupts the Doma Showdown and bookends Volume 1, Togata is one of a kind. They've been alive for over 300 years due to their regeneration blessing, and they've stopped caring about anything other than films, wanting to make Agni the star of their own movie. This is another reflection of Fujimoto's real life, with Togata basically being a self-insert for his love for movies. When we first meet Togata, they have a lot of characteristics of the nihilist camp, until they meet Agni, who serves as their near-direct foil. While Agni is young, Togata is old. Where Agni is serious, Togata makes jokes. Where Agni is the actor, Togata is the director. This opposite dynamic makes their friendship really fun and interesting to read, making the short 2-chapter span of Agni, Togata, and their camerawoman Nanetto just hanging out one of my favorite parts in the entire story. Fujimoto's character writing really shines in these fun slice-of-life scenes, from Togata teaching the others foul English words, to showing them how to fight, or even just Nanetto and Agni chatting by the fire. It really helps the readers connect with the characters and understand their bonds. This fun and lighthearted character writing shows the basis for Fujimoto's future dynamics, like a prototype version of Aki, Denji, and Power from Chainsaw Man. This scene also works really well to show more of Togata's personality, revealing them to be pretty well educated, while up until this point they had just been kind of goofy and manic. This also reveals that they're not the greatest of influences either, serving as a devil on Agni's shoulder, keeping him constantly transfixed on Doma, trying to make him do what's best for the movie, not himself. But this isn't what makes Togata special. While their character is pretty charming and unique up until this point, all the pieces fall into place during one scene around the middle of the manga. Up until this point, Togata had been called a woman by everyone. But now that Agni has a cult, a follower with a mind-reading blessing, feeling it's his duty to his god, outs Togata as a trans man, leading Togata to run away. Agni chases after him, and once they start to talk, we see some of the best gender dysphoria representation I've ever read. In a tragic monologue, Togata talks about his struggles with gender dysphoria and his pure hatred of his body. In these lines, Fujimoto is able to encapsulate the feeling of near inescapable horror that comes from gender dysphoria, the horror of looking at yourself in the mirror and seeing a stranger staring back at you, how that can destroy your mental health day after day. And Togata, trapped in that cycle for hundreds of years by his regeneration blessing, has been contorted into who we meet at the start of the manga. This recontextualizes why he loves movies so much. While in part, they're why he knows he's trans, they also serve as his only viable escape from who he is now, something that allows him to go beyond himself and just for a movie's runtime, be swept up into a nicer world. Fujimoto also uses Togata's transness to draw a comparison between him and Agni, both suffering from the same curse of regeneration, both unable to escape it. This scene is what made me want to talk about Fire Punch.
And it's only made more impactful by the unintended mirror it holds up to the situation being faced by trans youth in the United States right now.
Hundreds of gender-affirming clinics have been shut down across the country after being targeted by a conservative misinformation campaign, leaving tens of thousands of at-risk trans youth to face that same cycle of dysphoria without proper medical care. And this is only getting worse. In the first 2 months of 2024 alone, there have been 452 anti-trans bills introduced across the country, leaving the future for trans Americans looking very bleak. This modern recontextualization of the scene made it hit so much harder for me as a trans person, but the way the scene ends makes it virtually perfect. With all of the violence that surrounds this conversation, the piece of Agni just accepting Tagata for who he is gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, everything will be alright here too. This sentiment is what the manga is truly about. No matter how futile and shit life seems, it's worth pushing through till tomorrow. And this really resonates with a lot of people who read Fire Punch, and it especially connected with me during my read. This is why I love this manga, despite my problems with it. Being able to craft a tragic yet kind of heartwarming story makes Fire Punch an incredible experience to read. The positive take on the pressure of existing found throughout the manga makes it so much more powerful, giving the reader some mental reprieve from the sheer amount of suffering that everyone faces, as well as giving them the ability to understand their own life better. But that suffering is still a key part of the manga, with the cycle of trauma forcing growth under the characters under the threat of death. We can see this cycle starting from the opening chapters, with Agni bottling his trauma as rage, this forced growth stunting his emotion, keeping him focused on one thing to keep him alive. This is what kept me on the edge of my seat throughout the entirety of my read. You can really see how close Agni and the other characters come to having a psychological break. So when Agni starts to find a sense of self during the second siege of Behemdorg, realizing he wants to protect others, a real sense of relief washes over the reader. This sense of relief holds solid as he finds his footing as a leader, but we start to see cracks form as we approach chapter 42. It's in this chapter that he and Tagata set out to kill Doma once and for all. By this time, they find him living on a farm with a family of children who he's dedicated himself to protecting. Agni, realizing that killing Doma would result in all the kids' deaths, he spares him. This moment of growth shows Agni finally breaking out of that cycle of trauma that's kept him trapped in his violent ways since the start of the manga. He even decides to embrace his role as God if it means being able to protect those who rely on him. That feeling of hope floods back into the readers as we see Agni and Tagata walking back to camp, until we see Luna, Agni's long-dead sister, standing there. This hallucination asks him to kill Doma and become Fire Punch. Then, we're left with this panel of Agni, his face completely melted off. In light of what just happened, let's talk a bit about dissociative identity disorder. Originally discussed by Morton Prince in his 1906 book, The Dissociation of a Personality, the concept has been developed and debated for the past century. The basic idea of DID is that a person who has it contains multiple personalities, called alters for short, which they unwillingly change between. When an alter is active, the person has no memory or control of their actions. The psychodynamic view of DID says that the alternate personalities originate from repressed trauma, which lines up pretty well with what's happening right now. Agni's unconscious just can't get over someone who ruined his entire life getting off scot-free, so an alter takes control as a Fire Punch persona, a coping method to take his unconscious emotions out via violence. These multiple personalities also tie back into Agni's name, which, while coming from the Sanskrit word for fire, that word itself originates from the Hindu god of fire of the same name. While that ties into his godhood, it more importantly alludes to the god's two faces. One is depicted as beneficial, while the other destructive, and our Agni's destructive side can be seen in the carnage we're greeted with after he takes back control of his body. Doma's entire household lay in a pile of ash, with the bodies of him and his family incinerated, with Agni left standing in the middle. This is a crushing blow to Agni and his mental state, resulting in an attempt to drown himself for what he's done. This leads Tagata to pull Agni out at the last second, catching himself on fire in the process. This is the first time we've seen Tagata really care about something other than movies, and as he lays next to Agni, burning away, he leaves him with one final word: live. The same word his sister left him with at the start of the manga. This scene crushed me emotionally, with the hope-filled trans scene coming just 6 chapters before it, but it also connected me to exactly what the characters were feeling. This loss of Agni's best friend and one of the most impactful characters in the story draws out a genuine sensation of grief from the reader. The introduction of more complex psychological elements shows the glaring detriment of the trauma growth cycle that's plagued every character in the manga from the start, revealing that the cruelty of the world is not just the ever-present cold, but the inner wounds from it. The way Fujimoto shows the damage of untreated trauma works as a commentary on how we don't adequately treat trauma in the real world due to our own threats. Instead of the crushing cold, the constant cycle of working to stave off unemployment and homelessness forces us to bottle our problems while continuing to wear down our mental health. Moments like this are what prompted me to look back in my own life and actually helped me start to come to terms with some of my own trauma. Unfortunately, in the manga, the characters don't get that chance, with the seemingly endless cycle of growth and trauma for Agni only being broken in the concluding chapters. Talking about it will involve me spoiling the end of the series, so if you don't want to hear about it, skip to the timestamp on screen. Millennia after both Judah and Agni had their minds wiped and subsequently replaced, they meet once again, but this time in the cold void of space, the world having been destroyed centuries ago. The two being cruelly kept alive by their blessings. Having not talked to anyone in ages, they're thrilled to meet each other, even crying over the fact they had company. Then they hug, and in either's first warm embrace since the destruction of the world, they both pass away, finally allowing the two to escape their trauma and pain. This is an amazing and tranquil ending for a manga that had been up until this point filled with non-stop death and violence. This peaceful feeling only bolstered by Fujimoto's stellar art and use of white negative space. Just looking at their final embrace brings a charming sense of calm to the reader. In that same interview where he mentioned Chaser, Fujimoto was really harsh on his own art, but I can't see why. In every scene I read, the art really helped immerse me in the world, and his unique style captures the feeling of everything and everyone present in the panel. Take the establishing art when we first get to Behemdorg as an example. It's breathtakingly beautiful while also teaching the reader things like the city's religion and politics in just a couple panels. Juxtapose that with the city's dark underside filled with blessing slaves that power the city. The concept itself is horrifying, but the way Fujimoto fills the negative space with pitch black forces the reader to feel the pure terror of being trapped right alongside the characters. His fight scenes are even more powerful than that, with a lot of them feeling like storyboards for animation with how smoothly they flow. Take this fight between Togata and the Behemdorg soldiers as an example. The amazingly choreographed panels where Fujimoto mixes Togata's goofiness with the brutality of them dispatching a whole train of soldiers shows off their strange personality really well. These amazing qualities continue in every fight scene in the manga. Like, look at these panels from various fights and how they all capture a special energy. That energy is what best encapsulates the series as a whole. A rush of adrenaline mixed with some beautiful moments of humanity. That sensation is what makes this manga wholly unique and, in my opinion, amazing. Despite my gripes with some of the aspects, Fujimoto tells a story that could not have been told by anyone else. With his amazing art skills complementing his engaging writing, he created greatness. This short 80-chapter series has some of the best character moments I've ever read. And if you're able to look past some of the more questionable elements, please go read this manga. There is so much more to explore if this series interests you. I'd recommend reading the whole thing from start to finish, because I only covered some of the main events. There were a lot of character moments I skipped over that if you liked this video, you'd appreciate. I didn't even talk about the mute guy who has swords come out of his middle fingers like Wolverine claws and is an absolute killing machine, all while only wearing underwear. So, to read stuff like that, go check out the manga. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see more from me, you should check out the video that just popped up, and subscribe to see anything else I make. Thanks now, bye.